Morning, everybody, and welcome to another of the Teaching Academy's PD series for 2026-60. This morning's session is around supervised assessment, and we're picking up where we left off last week talking about Microsoft bookings, but specifically we're moving into preparation in Brightspace and setting up what's happening in the LMS in conjunction with our bookings tool. So it will take a few kind of different stages as we work through this. The first thing I'm going to do is do a very, very quick sort of refresh of where we got up to last time. And I'm thrilled that so many of you have gone ahead and created your first lot of bookings and meetings, etc. I had a whole bunch of people reach out to me during the week saying that they'd managed to work through it and send them out, etc. And most of those were entirely successful, which is great. So essentially where we got up to last time round was we'd worked through accessing the bookings tool, and we'd established that the two main areas of the booking tool we wanted to use, assuming I'm going to get hit with Duo again, let's just deal with that, shall we? Gotta love Duo. Love you so much, Duo. All right, so we had the fact that you were sent an invite to get into your school's shared booking page, that you've gone into your school booking page, and the two main areas that we would be working in would be the services area, which is all of the events that we create, and potentially maybe the staff area if you needed to adjust your individual availability settings in terms of your general availability. That's the only real kind of need that you would have to go into the staff area if you were looking at your own staff settings, and the fact that you would have these general availability hours set. I mention this again today because sometimes people have issues with this when they've created their bookings areas and they haven't actually checked to see what their general availability is, because sometimes they can run contra to the availability that you've set up in your service. So if you created a service for bookings and you said, I'm going to be doing my marking between 6 and 8 o'clock at night, but you've got these general availability settings in the background saying that you don't do anything past 5 o'clock, there's going to be a problem. It's not going to be available for students to book. So you do need to make sure that these essentially align with what you're putting into each individual booking service that you create. I can see a few nods going on, so hopefully that makes sense to people. It's the only time really I'd be messing around with staff settings, and it's usually something that conveners will come to me about when they've got markers who are not appearing with bookings. It's because the markers availability settings also haven't been looked at. Otherwise, we create services in our bookings area. We end up being given a link to those individual bookings. And then after we have a service created, we then move into what do we do with that. And right at the end of last session, we talked about how we make it available to students inside Brightspace. So that's where I'm going to pick up very briefly here this morning, looking at hopefully somewhere where I've created a service so that I can then provision that. So I think I was playing around with nursing last time, if I recall, so there should be something in there for me to mess around with. That'll do. Hopefully you'll only have one of those schools available to you as opposed to me. And you'll see that these lists now available are much shorter, and it's because they have done a fresh provision of all of the schools' booking pages, so that now I think initially when they set it up, there were some issues with some students having certain types of email accounts where the bookings links were going through to junk mail and things like that more often, like iCloud accounts and things. All of that's been taken care of now, so they'll get it within their main folders and we'll have far fewer issues with student bookings. I think I'll just appropriate 521's booking page here. They've created bookings that are 30 minutes long. Here's the bookings page link. That's what I want. So I'm going to copy that link here and then jump into Brightspace just so we can talk about what we're going to do with our bookings pages links. I'll use this side. And I think where we left off essentially was I'd mentioned to you that there is a new type of content template available for you to use inside Brightspace where you could create new pages, and the type of page that you can create inside Brightspace for bookings actually has a template already available for you. So if you go to Select Template and Bookings, you would find that there is in fact all of this pre-populated text available to you that you can then customize if you like. It's very comprehensive. Maybe there's too much information in there for your liking, but most importantly, it'll give you a spot to put your booking link in there for students to click on. So if I went in there and just said, give me that, you could paste the whole thing if you like, or you could make it something a little more concise, highlight it, and then hyperlink it with your booking page link, at which point you've got a link for students to click on to open up the bookings page. I'm not going to spend any more time really talking about this other than the fact that there's a template there with all that information available for you to give to students. That's one way that you would make that information available, and then at that point the students could come in, whoops, click on the link, and then be taken directly to the bookings page and start making their bookings. That's the long and short of it. The other way that you might want to make that information available to students is by sending them an announcement, for example, and you can provide the link to them directly there as well. So if I was to create a new announcement in here and said, hey everyone, book here, and then said right there, same thing again, highlight the text, hyperlink, and off we go. There's the bookings page. They get the announcement in the link, and then they can go through and start making bookings. I'm sure you've come up with other strategies for how you might provide the information to students, etc., but those are the two obvious ones. Potentially also in your assessment item description area as well. I'll leave that up to you, but that's where we got up to last week. What we're going to be talking about today, if I can find my Padlet wall again, we've mentioned the bookings template and creating links and announcements. We're going to be talking about what else needs to be set up in Brightspace, and particularly we'd like to talk a little bit about rubrics and the fact that when we work with supervised assessment, the rubric becomes very, very important, because what you'll find in your subject outlines is, I'm assuming, you probably currently have one single rubric that's going to need to have something done to it, if it hasn't already, to be able to facilitate marking of the supervised assessment. So that's what we're going to be talking about a little bit, and then I'm going to be looking more at the functional aspects of how we make that available in Brightspace. So a few questions for you, and I might switch this into our slideshow view so that you can see the text. So let's move right along. There are some, okay, let's make this. All right, so some questions for you to think about. How many rubrics are you going to be using? And it might seem obvious to you, but in some cases, there have been instances where they've split off and said, actually, we're going to split this into two different rubrics, one for the supervised component and one for the submitted artifact. So that's when we're talking about an integrated supervised assessment. For those of you using a standalone supervised assessment, that's obviously a moot point. You'll have one area that the marking is happening in. But if there's going to be two rubrics, obviously, then there are some considerations there to think about. The first one is, and this I think most people are across by now, is that the weighting for each part of a supervised assessment, the supervised versus the submitted component, need to be the same. They have to be weighted evenly. So if you are simply going in and taking the original criterion that you had in your subject outline and saying, well, I'm just going to split it 50-50, that's fine. But think about how that's going to actually look to the students as well, if it actually makes sense to them what is being assessed in each part. It usually means the rubric has to be recrafted in a way so that each of those parts makes sense. Functionally, I'm telling you that you need to have them weighted evenly, and I'll be looking at how the point allocations work in rubrics and things. But in terms of what goes into the rubric, um, content, etc., I know that Elise is going to be spending some more time in subsequent sessions delving more into the design of the rubrics itself and the language, etc., and differentiating out those different parts. Today, we're going to be looking at the functional aspects in Brightspace. All right, sequencing is really important, which is why I've talked about this part here about different dates required potentially for parts of the task. In Brightspace, if you've got different dates that you need students to be doing things, like part 1, submit by this date, and part 2, your supervised component happens at a later date, that's fine as a starting point. But what happens if you're also saying that the students need feedback on the first part before they come to the supervised component? If we have that needing to happen, it can't happen inside a single assignment portal, right? Because it would mean you need to do all the publishing, release the feedback to the students, and then potentially unpublish it so that you can then go ahead and mark the second part as well. Like, it's just getting too messy at that point, which is why people start talking about having separate assignment portals with different due dates on things so that they can handle the marking for each part of the sequence. Other subjects, people aren't actually providing feedback on the submitted component. They're doing all of the marking around the document and the feedback on the supervised component all in the one go. So if that means you're not releasing it until the whole thing is finished, then you don't need separate dates and separate portals to handle that. I want to spend most of the time in Brightspace itself, so I'm not just talking hypothetically about this stuff, but I just put a few questions in here for you to think about before we start looking at how we set those things up. Okay, is it a group or an individual assessment? This is important, particularly when we're talking about setting up Microsoft bookings, just from a functional point of view, because when we create a new service, one of the elements of our setup when we're creating them is this area here. How many people can attend the booking? Some people have sort of taken this at face value and gone, oh, well, I want, there's 4 students in the group, so I'm going to let 4 people book. We have no control over which 4 people are coming in here and making this booking, which means that you're getting a grab bag of different individuals able to book into the same times that are not necessarily in the same group. So you can see that it's not as simple as saying, I'm just going to create a booking and allow 4 people to book in here at once. Bookings doesn't organize them in any particular way like that. It just says anyone with a link can book into those slots until all 4 of them are available. So if it is a group assessment, my advice to you is still only make a booking for one person to do the booking and get a group leader or one of the students within the group, for example, to make the booking and share it with the others in their group, rather than trying to get bookings to handle 4 different sets of students, etc. Maybe you're asking them in terms of your custom fields, for example, in the bookings area to identify who the other people are in the group so that you've got their names, for example. So you could create a custom field and say, oh, tell me who else is in your group? That would be a way of handling this. But don't expect bookings to handle all 4 of the group members in that instance making a booking in here. Just get one to do it. Keep it nice and simple and have them share the link to the meeting with the others in their group. All right, going back to our questions. Different file formats for the task. If you've told the students that the submitted component for an integrated supervised assessment requires, for example, a video format, then that means when you set up the Brightspace portal, it's going to have to allow for those formats. I'm just, I guess, stating the obvious here. Think about what you're asking them to submit in this space. Are they submitting anything at all? And that will inform the type of assignment that we set up in Brightspace. If it's just an evaluation or an observation, or are we expecting them to submit something? And then the last two questions, do we need Turnitin for this? If they're submitting a written component that needs to be checked against Turnitin, we'll need to turn on Turnitin, obviously. And how many attempts do they get for the task? So these are things that we normally think about when we set up assignment portals in Brightspace anyway, but we're going to be looking at them from the point of view of setting up for a supervised assessment. All right, let me get this off the screen and we'll jump into Brightspace. Get rid of bookings. Okay, so in the event that we're setting up a new assignment portal in Brightspace for a supervised assessment, thinking about those different questions that I was asking a minute ago, the due date component is going to come into play. It's going to come into play when you're deciding that the marking for this needs to be finished and rounded out. So if there is a step one, stage one area where you want to give the students back feedback, you're going to be saying that for this supervised assessment, don't use my naming conventions there. That would have the first due date in there, and then the second, you would need to create a second portal for the supervised component. So maybe the first one would be the document with one due date, and then you would end up creating a second portal for the second part. This only really is relevant to you if you want the students to have feedback on the first part before they can do the second. I don't want to harp on that too much, but we had a lot of people that had that assumption that the students would get feedback on the document before they came into their supervised assessment. It's only going to be possible if you're publishing the marking from the first part before they go into the second. That's why I've made this point multiple times. Our other questions that we had in here is the type of files. Whether it's a group or an individual assessment, you're going to need to be changing the assignment type when you set it up. The type of files available. If it's a file submission for the document part of an integrated supervised assessment, followed potentially by the observation, then you can leave this as a file submission. But if you're simply observing them and evaluating them in the rubric, then you would be choosing observed in person. There is no need for the students to submit anything at that point. Still make the booking, still come to the booking, but you'll be marking in the rubric and the students are not required to submit anything. So that informs the type of submission that we're using. How many files? Normally we leave this on unlimited by default. And if you are requiring them to submit video files, for example, which some people had going on, you need to make sure that the file extensions that are allowed support that. So no restrictions, I guess, is not putting any rules in place. The moment that you go to our default setting here, which is annotatable files, which will mean PDF, Word, Excel, and PowerPoint, we've now narrowed down the type of files that students will be able to submit. And if you're wanting them to submit video at that point, like a narrated presentation, the only way this is going to work is if it's voice over PowerPoint. So I know I'm getting a little bit niche here for those of you that are using that, but you need to keep that in mind when you're setting up your file extensions. I think I've mentioned this, if not in the last session, in plenty of other PD that we've run. You need to leave on the all submissions are kept setting when you're setting up your assignments. Otherwise, when you're doing your marking in the student's submission, if they were to resubmit, your marking would disappear because it's not the most recent submission. So that's the danger of choosing this last option, only the most recent submission. Sounds good in theory until the part where a student resubmits over the top while the marking is going on. Then the marking disappears. So leave it as all submissions kept. And then we'll be able to start talking about rubrics, which is where I wanted to end up this morning. Let me stop there for a minute and see. Elise, have we got anyone raging in the chat while I've been ranting here? Or does anyone have a question from the floor about what I've been talking about so far?
The chat is nice and quiet at the moment, Lachlan, so I think you're doing a great job of covering everything, unless anyone wants to potentially come off mute onto mic, which you're of course more than welcome to do so.
Anyone? Nope. Okay. Well, look, yeah, don't stand on ceremony. You're welcome to either put your hand up, put things into the chat, etc. I know that we've been dealing mostly with revision or recap so far. So let's get into talking about rubrics a bit, where we get some more detail. What I have inside this subject site is 3 different approaches to setting up rubrics for us for an integrated supervised assessment. So I'm going to jump into my rubrics area. And the 3 of them are here. Okay, so the first one I'm going to open up here and preview. Is that we have created a rubric where we are using different sections of the rubric tool to split out product versus the observation, the supervised component. And in the rubric tool, that means we get labels within each different section to show that difference. So here's the first part dealing with the criteria. And then if we move down to the second section in the rubric, there it is. We have a new label available for dealing with the supervised component of the task. Inside the rubric tool itself, when you create, let's just make a new rubric so I can demonstrate this. Here's our label up here when we only have, with a starting rubric, everything in one section. But the moment that I add a new section to the rubric tool, which is this area here, criteria group, it then now allows us to put those labels in on our different sections. So if we said this was the submitted product that the students have put in, as opposed to the supervised component, it's very simple to be able to label those different sections effectively, right? So that should be fairly straightforward. Create different sections in your rubric rather than just adding additional criterion. It's the only way that you're going to get labels at the top to differentiate the two. If we go back to our example that we were looking at there, BMS. This one has been set up so that it is graded out of 100, which is generally my advice to people when they're creating rubrics. You don't have to have a rubric that has the same point values as the task weighting. Brightspace will convert them for you. So rather than deal in tiny fractions of numbers and decimals, etc., it's usually easier to make your rubrics out of 100. And I would advise that as a general approach if you haven't already. But this one, I can see if I scroll to the bottom, has been set up out of 100. And that means that we can set up our overall score areas to also give us scoring out of 100. And that will then convert to the weighting of the task. We've run plenty of other PD around using the rubric tool, but on the Padlet board today, I've got links to some of the videos, etc., around rubric creation if you need help with that. Right, going back up to the top. Next question that we have is how do we deal with our subject outline that might only have the one criterion outlined, having to split it so that it deals with supervised versus product. One strategy that we just looked at a second ago was to create a whole different section within the rubric tool and just recreate all of the criterion again, where you're essentially dealing with part 1 and part 2. Same criterion labels, but you can then go in and differentiate the scale descriptors at that point. So the label should be the same, but the descriptors can then be different. What it is that you're scrutinizing in the task for the supervised component versus the submitted product are of course going to be different. They can't be the same thing. One's a document, one's an observation, just at a very superficial level. And as I said, Elise is going to get more into what we put into our rubrics, content-wise, etc., in some of the sessions that she'll be running from next week on. So easiest way, take all of the existing criterion areas and just duplicate them in a second section. So this rubric that we looked at a moment ago had, where is it, BMS, 100 points. It's an integrated task. They split it into 2 sections. That's probably the easiest way I can think of to take your existing subject outline and then have it ready for your markers. And then you can say to the markers, right, you're now marking part 1. So that means in Brightspace that you could open this up for marking and only mark up part 1 and then tell the markers to then come back when they're ready to conduct the supervised assessment and mark up part 2. What would that look like inside the assignment area? Let's have a look. There's an integrated task sample, that'll do. Okay, so if we have a look at this gentleman with this submitted document, if we have a look at the rubric, 2 sections, 100 points, that's what we want. Let's pop out the rubric. We can see here that the product criteria, you can see I've got a labeling convention in there that tells me what this part is about, has been marked up by the first lot of markers. They've come through when they're ready to mark the document. Maybe they provided comments underneath. But once they've finished part 1, once we get to the end of part 1, maybe it's another week in between when that happens and the supervised component, but the markers can then come back and mark up the supervised component in the same rubric when they need to. It will then retally the scores and send those through to the overall grade inside Brightspace. So when we make changes to our draft saved assessment, this time around I'll go, that can be 8.2. Let's make some changes. So we've got a new score there. It auto saves and then it sends the new tally through to the overall grade and converts it to the weighting for the task. So there is no issue with you approaching the same rubric at multiple points in time. That's the point I'm trying to make here. One rubric for marking over different stages is not a problem. And again, each time you go through, save draft until the convener is ready to publish all and release. So this is the most common approach to marking, particularly with integrated tasks with supervised assessment, is that you're going to be using the one single rubric split to handle the different parts of the process, product versus supervised component. If you are going to create multiple rubrics where you're looking at the supervised component versus the submission itself, you will have to do that in 2 different assessment portals. And the reason for that is every time you make an adjustment to a rubric in Brightspace, it will recalculate the overall grade tally. It'll send it through. So there's no way you could do that for the first part, for the submitted document, for the first rubric, and then go and mark up a second rubric and somehow have the 2 of them magically add up together. It's not going to work. It will only take the most recent revision of the most recent rubric to give you this score. Does that make sense? All right. So let's have a look at some other approaches to rubrics that could be taken in this space. In this case, the same rubric has been used. They have split it into 2 different sections, but they've left the task weighting as the same, which was out of 40. So again, they've split the first section for the product criterion areas. Second part will be dealing with the supervised component. There it is. But the numbers have been left the same as the original weighting in the subject outline. So if we go to the bottom, we'll find that this is in fact out of 40 rather than 100. There's no problem with you doing that if you like, but it tends to lead towards having very, very small numbers and fractions of numbers inside the outline itself. It's a bit more unwieldy, and it's unnecessary really when you could just make it out of 100 and make it nice and easy. All right, the third approach that you might consider taking is using all of the existing criteria that you have in your rubric and just having them one after the other. Part A, Part B, for example, for the first criterion. So here we can see first criterion for the outline, and all they've done is put in an A at the beginning. So that's for the submitted component. And then directly underneath, there'll be 1B, where they're dealing with the supervised component. And I haven't put anything in the descriptors here at this stage, but all that does is split the weightings evenly, one after the other. Some people have said that's easier for their markers to deal with, just saying A and B, A and B, A and B all the way through, rather than separating them out into two different sections. I'll leave that up to you. Like, there's nothing stopping you from creating a rubric like this, where you have them one after the other. Personally, I like my assumption is that you're not going to be doing the marking for the submitted component at the same time as the supervised component. So it makes sense to me to separate those two parts of the rubric out into different sections. But if you want to create A and B one after the other, go for your life. You certainly can do that. There's nothing in the rubric tool stopping you from doing that. Okay. I have some examples of some subjects for us to look at, and then maybe we can have a think about how well they went. That's a good question, Michelle. Can we leave part B blank? I wouldn't. I think it's important that the students know what it is they're getting the scores for there. So at the very least, I'd probably be copying the same things that are coming from the first part. But really, it doesn't make much sense depending on what's been put into the scale descriptors themselves. I've seen some people simply just copy and paste, take out or cut even half the criterion descriptor out of the first part and paste it into the second part if it makes more sense for the supervised component, but I wouldn't be leaving it empty. It does make the rubric long, particularly if you're just copying them, but hopefully I would be taking out the elements of those descriptors and pasting them in where they're relevant to the supervised part. Again, it depends on what's in the rubric. In a lot of cases, the outline rubrics that I've seen haven't been really scrutinized or put together to clearly articulate the difference between those two elements of the task. I think it is pretty important though. Let's look at some examples. Get rid of that. Move the Teams thing out of the way, Lachlan. All right, first example I want to look at is EPT 505. All right, so this was in 30, so this the session that's just finished. And if we have a look at their assignment area first, let's see how they approach their setup of their portals. Hopefully by now you will have all seen as well that we now have this lovely rubric icon sitting on our assignment dashboards to show us clearly if there is a rubric attached and available. We don't have to go hunting for them anymore. It tells us from the setup whether there's a rubric in place or not. And for these guys, this is an integrated task and the supervised component is called a professional consultation. So assessment item 1. I'm not quite sure of the distinction between TS and LS, but let's get in and have a look at the rubric itself. Noticing that there are in fact two different portals in place here. So we'll go into the rubric section of this subject and see what they've set up. Okay, professional consultation, TS. Let's have a look. Okay, so their part 1 is the supervised component, interestingly. And then if we go through and have a look at Well, now they're talking about component B. Interesting. So we started talking about part one, and now are you talking about components? Okay, I'm a little bit confused so far. Keep going. Now there's component C. Again, is there a difference here between the supervised component? It's talking about articulating, justifications, explanations, demonstrations. These all sound like supervised elements to me. That's good. Now there's a component D. Okay, again, still supervised. So this is looking to me like the elements of the rubric in place here are appropriate to the supervised component. And then part two, we have the documentation. So that's interesting. Does this mean that the document submission happens second? I wonder. And are the labels the same for each part of this rubric, which we said was important in terms of the actual criterion label, not what goes into the descriptors. Of course, they're going to be different, but the labels. So I might just take a snip of this and compare the two. So component A's label was talking about developing key takeaways, okay? And what was component A up here for the supervised component? It's talking about developing rationales. So here's a problem for us. We need the labels, the criterion labels, to be the same. The descriptors absolutely need to be different. They are going to be different because you're looking at scrutinizing a submitted document or the submitted component, and what you're looking for there is going to be different. But the label itself needs to be the same. And it's certainly what's going to be probably in the rubric in the subject outline. So with our empathetic hats on here, is it going to be a problem for the students to understand why there is a difference between what's being articulated in those two different locations? Also makes it very hard to sort of justify how the weighting is the same when they could be completely different things. So this is something that we generally get into if you're having consultations with EDs or other people when you're putting your rubrics together. Keep in mind, not only do we need to make sure that the weighting for the supervised component versus the submitted component is the same, we need the criterion labels to be the same as well. You get into your points of difference in the descriptors. So that probably suggests that the labels that are in the rubric need to be generalizable enough that they can then go off into the specifics of the supervised component of the task or the submitted component of the task. Let me stop there for a second. Would it make it quicker to put the supervised component at the top when marking? I think it all depends on when it's happening, like the sequence for the students. To me, it makes sense. I haven't looked at this to see what they've told the students to do in the subject outline. I'm assuming that they submit the document first and then they take it in for the supervised component, or they're engaging with that consultation, etc. around it. But I don't know. I would say the rubric needs to mimic the workflow that the students have to go through for the task. Definitely I would be putting it at the top if that's the case. What do the students do first? If that's the case, put that at the top of the rubric. It's a good point. Does anyone else want to weigh in here? Come off mute, put any other questions in here. We're kind of, I suppose, nitpicking because we're dealing with the second sort of wave now of supervised assessment tasks where people have experimented in 30 and tried different things. We're working with new systems, new bookings processes. So of course we're going to be iterating in this space. Not so far? Okay, I'll keep going. We have some more examples to look at as well. A good example of that iterating that I was talking about, we can find in nursing. I'm going to have a look at 301 for a second. Have I already got it up here somewhere? Yes, I have. All right, so let's find 30. What did these guys do in session 30? They had one single submission point. This is a standalone supervised assessment. They're OSCEs that they have. They have a rubric attached to it. And if we have a look at the settings for the OSCE, interestingly. It is an observation. This has been left as a text submission, however. Moving forwards, they've now changed it since to being observed in person, because that's what's happening. Students don't need to submit anything. All that's happening is that the markers are coming into this space to do their observation, to use the rubric, to do the marking. So there's no need for this to be set as a text submission. But it was left as one single submission portal in Brightspace for this task. Now, the interesting part about this process for these guys, if we come down to the rubrics area, we can see there's something else going on here. 3 rubrics attached to one assignment portal. If we open it up, what we can see is that the students have multiple attempts possible for this task. So if they fail it the first time, they can then attempt it a second time. And the way that they've engaged with that is provided a separate rubric for each attempt. But if you recall what I said to you before about marking in the rubric tool in Brightspace, it will only accept and save the most recent version of the rubric that's being used in terms of tallying the score. So that might give us a problem because it will wipe everything that happened in attempt 1 in terms of scoring and grades and replace it with attempt 2 if that happens. So that could be a complication. They've also got a separate rubric in here for another part of the task that they do beforehand before they do their observation. So there are 3 different rubrics for the markers to wrangle with, all attached to the one single submission portal inside here. So this could be a complication for our markers. If we then jump into session 60 and see how they may have changed their approach, same subject. This time round, they've created a separate submission portal for each of the attempts. So the markers only need to engage with, for example, the rubric for the second attempt if the students need a second attempt in a separate portal altogether. This makes a lot more sense to me in trying to manage the markers, the attempts, the grades, and the evidence, the documentation that happens in this space. Separated out into 2 different submission portals. This one we only need to engage with when we need to. And if we have a look at the rubric settings themselves, there's the observation. They've changed that setting. And they only have the one rubric left for the markers to deal with. From my point of view, functionally, this is a lot cleaner and easier to deal with. But it took us a session to learn this and basically to make those changes. If we look at what's in the rubric itself, you can see that they've got all sorts of information being captured in here. I'll get to that, Michelle, in terms of what happens with the grade. In the rubric itself, they're capturing marker details, which is not a scored component. That pre-OSCE rubric that existed beforehand, they've now narrowed that down to another unscored component in the rubric, which they're just saying, was it satisfactory, not satisfactory? And then they get into the graded areas of the rubric where they can start tallying those numbers as well. So they're capturing lots of information in the rubric itself. Some of it scored, some of it not scored. But it's all happening inside a single rubric with multiple sections. So it's a lot easier for the markers not to have to be jumping in and out of different rubrics inside Brightspace. Now, back to Michelle's question around how the marking handles this. The answer is they use different categories inside the gradebook to capture all of these scores. So if we go through and have a look at the gradebook itself, we'll look at Manage Grades, and you'll see here that the OSCE attempts have been set up underneath a single category, and then it will take the value of the marking from the attempt that's going through to give them a score out of 100, essentially. Well, that's the weighting for the rubric, but the weighting for the task is 50. Right, so I guess we're finding the best parts of the tool to handle each part of the equation. So the same as I said before, we can't expect bookings to deal with group bookings of students. Brightspace will allow us to do that, so we use Brightspace to handle groups. We don't expect the submission portal to deal with, the rubric to deal with multiple attempts necessarily, so we get separate assignment portals that we can then organise inside the gradebook to organise the marking. It's about identifying which parts of the system can best deal with the different parts of the marking workflow. All right, moving right along. Inside the Padlet board for today, I have got some videos in here for you, but there is a link to a playlist which deals specifically with supervised assessment videos. Some of them are nice and short for you to watch. Others are a bit longer, workshops that will work through using the rubric from the ground up. But you can access all of those inside the Padlet board for today. I am aware that time is getting away from me, so that's the third session. Hang on, let me bring up the right one. All right. We've been talking about rubrics. I talked about the fact that if you can use 100 points when you create rubrics, you probably should. Makes it a lot easier. The rubric statistics tool, if you're unaware of it, it will allow you to scrutinize both the marking progress that's happening and the distribution of grades, etc., from the students during the marking process, rather than having to wait for all the grades to be published. If you haven't seen it before, I've got a sample here for you to look at, which is NUR 104. Let's have a look how that played out in session 30. All right, so we access it by going into the rubrics tool itself. Find the specific rubric that you're looking for. You'll notice that these are all locked because they were used for marking. And the OSCE was their supervised standalone assessment, if you recall. So I'm going to have a look at the statistics for attempt 1. So if we hit the drop down and go to view stats, what we can see inside the rubric stats tool, if we go to competency activities, we get our top-down view, how many were marked, how many attempt 1 rubrics were marked, what was the average scores for this. Remember that this is updated live, so we don't have to wait for the marks to be published. This is an in-situ view of how the marking is going, even if your markers are using draft marking, because it's looking at the rubric, not at the Brightspace final grade. Then we can dive down further by hitting the Actions button. Let's have a look at the individual criterion statistics. So if you want to review each of the individual criterion areas as the marking has happened to see how the grades are being distributed, you can do that. But the best part of this tool is that you can look at this at an individual mark level, where we can look at all of the individual students' submissions if we need to. We could then go and have a look at individual cohorts of students if we wanted to look at how that spread was happening across different cohorts. Or if you're using marking groups, for example, you could then go and look at how individual markers are progressing, how much of the marking is complete, for example, what the grade distribution looks like across individual markers. All of that stuff can be accessed during the marking process, and then we also get a timestamp against the individual markers happening over here on the right-hand side. So this tool is particularly useful when you've got a well put together rubric. So I always like to give the rubric stats tool a plug if I have a chance. Okay, let's keep going. There are more videos in that Padlet wall, as I mentioned, around how we put together those different rubrics for integrated tasks versus standalone tasks. We've gone through most of it today. I will talk a little bit about the gradebook configuration. If you are using multiple portals, as we saw in that nursing sample, They're going to require multiple rubrics, one for each, ideally, and that will mean multiple columns. If you're dealing with multiple columns for your assessments, you're probably going to need to use categories inside the gradebook to help organise them. And if you're going to be viewing a whole bunch of different columns for these tasks, you probably want to utilise short names just to make navigating through your gradebook easier. The easiest way to do that, if we go back into one of our examples here, let's see if they did it inside 104. They have. So here's a category. Underneath the category, all of the different parts of that task, and they've utilised short names here to make them nice and concise so they can see all the columns at once. So if you're not using short names already in your gradebook, I really encourage you to do so. Makes the whole experience much more palatable for the marker. It doesn't impact how the students see the gradebook. They will still see the original names for the columns. If that doesn't make sense to you, switch across to Manage Grades. You can select all at the top here. And if you use this bulk edit function, it will then let you scrutinise the full name that the students will see and then the short names if you have any in place. If you don't, you can easily populate them here all at the same time. It's a nice shortcut there to making sure the columns are usable for both the students, obviously, but more importantly, I think in this case, for the markers, for the convener in trying to navigate through what could be a very unwieldy gradebook. Okay. Let me stop there for a second. I'll have a look at Liz's example here. Let's say we're using one rubric for an integrated assessment. Okay. Has a product section, a supervised section. Okay. Student passes the product. Okay. But doesn't pass the supervised. Okay. But passes the overall assessment task when the marks for both sections are combined. It's a really interesting question. Keep going with that. How are we then handling the fact that the students are supposed to pass the supervised component of the task? Well, that is a really good question, Liz. I think essentially it's going to require scrutiny from ultimately the convener, but really the markers should be across that as well. How do we deal with that in a rubric? It's always going to require scrutiny from the marker to make some kind of notation somewhere if they haven't passed that. Like with the saying that they're weighted evenly, we're doing that when we set it up with the scoring. But if they don't pass some element of, do you want to come off mute for a second? Let's talk this through.
Yeah, just that, you know, even though it's like it's working in the rubric and that's a really nice way to set it out, but if, you know, the requirement is that students need to pass the supervised component, but technically they've passed the whole the whole task, but perhaps not the supervised component. Just not sure how that, you know, if there's any way of reflecting that to flag in the rubric, perhaps.
I like Michael's answer there that he hasn't set a pass criteria for the supervised component. Elise, I might ask you to wade in on this one as well. My understanding is they have to be weighted evenly. Is it a requirement across the board that they have to pass the supervised component to pass the task? I suspect that that's not the case at the moment, unless it's discretionary.
Sorry, I thought that was in the requirements. I thought that's what we were aiming for.
My understanding at this point, Liz and Lachlan, is that at this point, our supervised assessments are not hurdle tasks. I've just pulled up the frequently asked questions section.
Well, it doesn't make it a hurdle. It just means that, you know, it's assurance of learning. It's that assurance of learning bit that, you know, they're not going to pass the whole assessment task if they've used AI for 50% of it, for example.
Yeah, so at this point, I believe the student would, in that circumstance, pass that particular task. Again, I think this comes back to, you know, whether or not we're going to make these tasks hurdles, you know, that it is required that you would pass both the components in order to be successful in the task itself, which at this stage we haven't put anything in place along those lines. Also just having a look at how failures are dealt with in the frequently asked questions section. Sorry, where did I find that? Oh, sorry, I've just pulled up the wrong thing. So it says, how should weighting, grading and failure be handled when an assessment includes a supervised component? It just says failure decisions should be based on overall alignment with subject learning outcomes rather than the format of any single assessment component. Where a supervised component is embedded within a broader task, performance should be considered proportionally in relation to the total weighting, which obviously is a 50% breakdown. So yeah, look, let me take that on notice as Lachlan's put into the chat, and I'll have a bit of a chat with some of my colleagues on the team, and we'll do our best to get back to you on that one, Liz.
Thank you. Yeah, just wondering. Yeah.
Yeah, no,
I
it's
think-
really,
I
I
think
mean,
it's an
otherwise
excellent
that works really
question.
nicely in the rubric, doesn't it? But I'm just wondering
yeah,
how you might flag that.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And you're not going to be the only one asking that, obviously. It's going to come up. I feel like the last time I heard it mentioned, which might have been kind of all of 6 months ago or something, but that it was at this point in time, it was still discretionary. But I feel like I heard Beck say something along those lines. But we'll come back to everyone on that.
Thank you.
No problem. And look, we are basically at time. So let's see all the things that I haven't talked about today and see if I can get into those in just a minute or two. Thank you for those of you that have to go. Marking teams and marking groups is something that gets talked about a fair bit in here. The one reason that I wanted to talk about them in today's space, when we're talking about bookings and supervised assessment, the question that is raised is often about capacity, marker capacity particularly, and how we can handle marker capacity in Microsoft bookings. And the answer is you can't really. What we have within Brightspace, however, is a tool that allows us to deal with caps, with student numbers, and that tool is our groups tool. Now, in the instance that if I find a subject site which is willing, were to go and create a new group, so I'll go into communication and groups. If we were to create a new group, even just with a specific number of groups where I'm manually enrolling them, and said I've got 5 markers, at that point, we have a tool that enables us to set caps and view those caps. I can turn around and change this to all the marker names. And then when I go to enroll users and add students to these groups, the number that has been allocated to each individual marker is visible at the top. So I could turn around and say, this marker has 1, 2, 3, whatever students. You get the idea here. You can then work through your class list and you can deal with your capacity this way. Now, whether you're using the groups tool to automatically split up the cohort evenly and then make adjustments, or you're manually allocating students like this one by one, this is one of the few tools that I think we have readily available to us where we can take care of those student number caps alongside our bookings and supervised assessment. So what I'm talking about there is if I set up the groups first and then I don't give the students across the whole cohort access to all of, I'm only going to give them access to the markers booking link for the students that have joined that group or been allocated to that group. So we need to kind of almost reverse engineer this solution. So whether you're allocating the students into groups, marking groups first, and then you give them the booking links, or whether you set up self-enrolling groups where the students choose which one they want to go into, and then they get the link to make their booking, that will allow you to keep an eye on these numbers and these caps from the get-go, essentially. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but I'm happy to talk through some of those marker allocation scenarios. But the bottom line is we can't handle them inside the bookings tool. It has no facility to deal with numbers. And the idea that you're going to be scrutinizing all of your marker hour availabilities and breaking it up into small chunks and then trying to figure out how many days at how many minutes times how many slots, and then hope that the students then fit nicely in line with that. It's a nice idea, but I can tell you from what we've seen so far, very rarely does it pan out neatly like that. And it leaves you with markers that are either vastly underutilized that capacity, or markers that have vastly overutilized that capacity, and then that's a separate administrative issue for the school to have to wade through. So if you're starting from the caps for the individual markers as a guiding kind of parameter in this space, the Brightspace groups tool is one of the best places I can think of to handle those numbers. As I said, I'm happy to talk more about that with people if they want to get into that with me, but I am aware that we are now past time. So what I'm going to be doing is stopping the recording in a moment and saying a big thank you to everyone for coming out for another of the sessions. We will continue to be looking through supervised assessment and its issues across the next month at least. I know Elise is running more sessions in and around rubric construction in terms of the qualitative elements of your rubric, and I encourage you to come out for those as well. Other than that, I will see you all at our next session. Have a great week.